Hello, everyone. If I haven't introduced myself enough today, I will do it one more time. My name is Lindsay Brown from the Beyond Clean team. We want to say thank you so much to 3M for sponsoring this virtual event today. Welcome to the final session of the Resist Conference, Standing Up to Superbugs and Surgical Site Infections. Dr. Hudson Garrett is the president and CEO of Community Health Associates, LLC, and has a faculty appointment as an adjunct assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. Dr. Garrett has lectured in more than 25 countries and given testimony to government and regulatory agencies on a variety of topics related to infectious diseases. I am so excited for Dr. Garrett to round out the day today. Dr. Garrett's going to discuss the role of a comprehensive medical device hygiene and infection control strategy as it relates to antisepsis, disinfection, and sterilization in the perioperative setting. So without further ado, Dr. Hudson Garrett, I'd like to welcome you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to each of you. And it's definitely been an exciting day of learning throughout the program today. I popped in and out of several presentations, and it's been some great interactive questions going back and forth. For the objectives for my final session for today, we're really going to look at how do we sort of combine everything that we've talked about, but in a more formidable strategy related to strategic medical device hygiene. And how do we decrease the risk of surgical site infections, but more broadly, healthcare-associated infections, especially with COVID going on right now. We know that we've got a lot of risk. We have some opportunities, and we have some specific things that we can do as it relates to clinical operations, as well as the protection of our providers. And then lastly is how do we maintain operations in a safe environment where people are confident in what they're doing, but we can also protect patients and maintain that. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a background related to U.S. healthcare quality as it relates to medical devices. And we could all agree that the complexity and the acuity of the patients that folks are serving has gone up tremendously. We know that the complexity of medical devices has gone up. But what I would ask is, has the complexity and sort of the evolution of our training process gone up equally as well? And I would say that it probably has not been near as substantial as it needs to be. And so when we think about complex devices caring for complex patients that are sicker, we know that we need to evolve that technology. We need to look out for these unintended consequences. And we really have to focus on what I like to call the 3 Ps: people, process, and products, in that order. The reason that people is first is that if we have an engaged, properly trained, competent healthcare provider or team member at the front lines caring for the patient, and we have a good process that's reliable, is going to eliminate, hopefully, human error and be focused on improving patient safety, then we can bring in these efficacious, great products that many of our vendor partners have talked about into the equation. But it really needs to be that very tiered approach. This will give us good consistency in what we do and also make sure that we have proper patient safety sort of safeguards in place. So I wanted to go back to a definition that to me is quite overwhelming. My little brother happens to be a malpractice attorney, and he talks in legal jargon. And when I read this definition, I sort of am like, well, this is crazy. This is a very extensive definition as it relates to medical devices. But the takeaway for us in the infection prevention arena is that a medical device is essentially anything that's used on the human body, right? It's going to be diagnostic. It could be therapeutic. It could be monitoring. So everything as simple as a blood pressure cuff all the way up through a surgical device, right? And so these are all things that are regulated carefully by the FDA. But if you look at what the FDA's strength is, it's in regulatory science, it's in review of efficacy information, safety data, really pre-market, right? Before it ever goes out into the market. And then it's up to manufacturers and us as clinicians to actually do that post-market surveillance to ensure that devices that are released into the marketplace are actually going to be maintained as safe, right? And looking for those potential red flags that might exist. Now, medical devices, we know, especially those that are used in the perioperative environment, have a lot of challenges. And I'll pick on a couple of examples throughout today's program that I think bring to life how important it is to look at the device and its intended purpose, but also equally important is where is that device likely to be used? And we'll go through a few examples. But when we look at things like channels and hinges and screws and O-rings, just as examples, I've done a lot of work, for example, in the endoscope world, and we know that this is a challenge. In many cases, it's just not possible to get these devices fully cleaned when they're reusable. And so it's important to know sort of the anatomy of the device, but also know how to maintain it properly. And you'll see that in a couple of the examples, there have been sort of gaps as it relates to maintenance-related questions and sort of that preventative servicing that needs to take place, as well as other challenges. So let's go through a few examples that I think we should all be able to relate to, either personally or professionally, right? And the first one is as it relates to glucometers, which we use all too often to do that basic chemistry of assessing how much glucose is in a patient's system, right? And the challenge with this is that there's sort of two different types of glucometers. There's glucometers that are licensed for commercial use in healthcare settings that are reusable and designed to be reusable. And then there's devices that are actually not designed for healthcare use at all, and they're really designed for consumer settings, like what you may buy for your grandmother who is diabetic and is only going to be used by that relative at home just for that one patient. And the challenge became is that in order to actually get a specimen, we need to make some type of puncture in the skin and collect blood. Right? And so the picture on the top right is part of the One and Only campaign that the CDC released. And it's kind of interesting to think that we have to remind clinicians in the U.S. about something as simple as not reusing devices that are single use. And in this example, what happened was there was actually blood puncture that took place. Blood went into the spring within the device that was never, ever approved for commercial use. It was only designed for that one patient. And there was transmission of hepatitis or HIV. Right? And so this is just one example. The bottom right there you'll see is an endoscope. And we know that endoscopes have been used for many, many years and provide a very valuable resource, right? They can be used for diagnostic and therapeutic purposes, but they also come with tremendous risk. We're essentially taking a device that is a black tube, has very, very little exposure to air or outside of the environment, if you will. It has the capability of growing organisms. There's areas inside some of these devices that we can't see at all. We can't clean them very effectively, and we really have very sort of, odd examples of how we can validate these devices consistently, right? There's a lot of tools out there, but our goal is to have a completely safe and sort of confidence interval as it relates to rendered devices. And so this is very challenging for us. So another example that came up last year when I was actually presenting at a conference was the gentleman that presented right before me. This was up in sort of the Kentucky-ish area. And there was an incident that the CDC was talking about as it relates to reuse of needles and syringes. Well, what a great topic to talk about when we think about vaccines, especially given all the discussions about COVID. Right? In this particular example, there was a medical assistant that was not properly trained, that was going out using a single-use sterile disposable device like this needle and syringe pictured here, was supposed to be administering vaccine, particularly influenza and hepatitis B vaccine, and was going out to multiple different companies in a 3 or 4 state area. Unfortunately, this individual was never trained on safe injection technique, did not handle the single-use sterile disposable device correctly, and actually misused these devices, and unfortunately did not change the needle and syringe between each patient. As you can imagine, this is a healthcare liability. It's an ethical dilemma. It's a medical malpractice issue. And now we have patients that are going to be very, very worrisome, rightfully so, about the safety of vaccines and those that are administering them. So even if we have devices that have good labeling like this product did, they can still be misused in the hands of clinicians or practitioners that are not properly trained. And that really brings in a good part of what I like to talk about, which is that human factors engineering part of this concept. Right? Let's look at another example, one of that many of you may be intimately familiar with, which is heater-cooler units in the perioperative space. This is a very interesting, almost a CSI type story where the CDC was able to work with the FDA, the medical device manufacturers, as well as individual healthcare facilities to track a source of infection back to where a device was physically made in a manufacturing facility, not even in the U.S. And so sort of that genetic blueprint, if you will, of these types of devices and the organisms found on them can be tracked back. And so this is an example of where a manufacturer then made modifications, sent them back through the FDA, And now we have a much safer system. And so there's this sort of seesaw effect of we need these devices in the marketplace to deliver upon the clinical care that's promised to our patients, right? But we also have to equally make sure that we can reliably and consistently render them safe between uses if they're if they're multiple use and reusable devices. And so from this example, the CDC issued new guidance as it relates to heater cooler units. This was widely adopted by healthcare institutions, but again, is yet another example of where there could be risk of design flaws, there could be risk of reprocessing, there could be risk associated with the individuals that are involved in the process because the reprocessing process is not even reproducible consistently. And so it really brings the question is, how do we make sure that every single time a patient has a device used, it is safe, it is clean, and it's going to be, efficacious enough to be used in those patients. So another example that unfortunately I had to get involved with personally was an Oklahoma hospital that had a reprocessing breach that resulted in about 1,000 patients being notified about this and being required to be tested for up to a year. Right. And luckily, so far, there have been no infection transmissions, reported. But again, this is an issue where when we have people that are highly trained, like our reprocessing colleagues or our nursing colleagues, it really goes back to, is the system set up to fail or is the system set up to be successful? And if it is, what steps do we have in place, sort of those guardrails for safety, quality, and infection control? And these are, again, just a few examples that I picked that sort of illustrate this point about where do we go in the future and what are sort of those red flags that we need to be aware of as it relates to device hygiene. So, a lot of people will ask me, they'll say, well, this is really an Ercp issue, or it's only related to endoscopes, or it's only related to glucometers. And in reality, it's not. And I think if there's one thing that COVID-19 has taught us is that the risk and vulnerability can sort of ebb and flow. I've talked to patients that are in normally good health that have had poor outcomes with COVID. And I've talked to people that have had very poor health that have actually had a very positive outcome from COVID. And so it really goes back to these types of conditions in these organisms. Yes, they can be targeted to folks with vulnerable health conditions, but they can also be completely non-discriminatory. And if you look at this chart, we see that there have been issues in the EGD space, the colonoscopy space, the bronch space. Certainly there's data that supports this in the urology space as well. And so it goes back to the concept of how do I ensure that any reusable device that I am using can be rendered safe, and what are sort of my accountability measures in place that will stop the line if there's any potential risk, right? And there's great tools out there like ATP, there's sterilization validation, there's a whole host of things on our toolbox that can help us do this. And now we're fortunate enough to have many single-use devices that also allow us an additional layer of safety and protection to ensure that transmission doesn't actually occur. So, many of us get up in the morning and we have a list of things to do. I know I start myself, my day off that way, and I sort of remind myself, yes, this is what I'm going to do. And I have this list of things that I want to accomplish. But in reality, we know that changes usually about 20 to 30 minutes into our workday. And as part of that, there's sort of two choices we can make. We can be proactive in our approach to infection control as it relates to medical devices, or we can be completely reactive. So let's just sort of start on the opposite side of the equation, which is a reactive approach. Let's say that I have a sterilization failure and I have to recall a lot of instruments, or I have a device that the manufacturer calls and says, hey, there's some type of major safety issue with this. We need to recall this product. We need to get it out of their system, right? And I go back to an example. Many years ago, I was doing a facility audit at a very large academic hospital, and we went into the central sterile processing department, and we just asked a question, how do you recall instruments? And they said, well, here's our policy. And I said, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, how do you recall instruments? And the goal was to take the person that was currently on shift, that was in that supervisor capacity, to say, what would you do at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, for example, or Saturday morning, should I say, or what do you do over the weekend when there's not somebody here that's manager or director level? How do you sort of handle this process? And it was an interesting exercise because it turned out in this facility that there were 3 different levels of people that the supervisor on duty had to go through in order to recall instruments. And the particular instrument set we actually pulled was probably not the best example for the facility, because they actually had this particular instrument set out in 63 places in the hospital, across the health system, should I say. And so there was a lot of work that had to be done, right? So that's all on the reactive side. Now, if we go back to medical device hygiene and what we can do proactively, we know that there's basic things like ensuring that we have properly trained personnel, that we have good systems in place to sort of look and evaluate our patients for a potential risk. We need to have good validation in place. And we also need to make sure that we don't recontaminate the environment or the instruments, right? And this has been a big issue as it relates to certain medical devices that we've talked about already today. So in addition to that, there are a couple of things that we always want to go back to and sort of have in our checkbox, our mental checklist, if you will, that says, are these really the right solutions? And really the first is this device even possible to be completely cleaned? Right. And it's great to have manufacturer's instructions. But let's say the manufacturer's instructions were last validated in 1996. Well, that probably doesn't have near as much play as a human factors validated reprocessing instruction, as an example, that may have been done in the last few years. And of course, we want to look at what are the disciplines that will be responsible for cleaning and disinfecting this device? Where are they going to physically do that work? Is it done in a central location? Is there some type of courier that's bringing the products back to the facility? Is another example. And then how do we ensure that what we are doing is going to be accessible each and every time, right? Part of that starts with that visual inspection, which I found through personal experience that so many people are not even well educated about how to do that visual inspection by the manufacturer. And some of the manufacturers don't even know what to tell you as well. And so this sets us up for sort of a ring of infection transmission that is hard to stop once we don't know what we're looking for. And I sort of make the analogy of, when you look at a chest x-ray, you need to know how to read it in order to treat the patient. And the same is true as it relates to medical devices. We need to know what we're looking for that's abnormal, and that really needs to be best defined by that manufacturer so that when we look at it, we recognize that we can take that device immediately out of service. And that's one of the advantages, I think, for certain things. And when we look at blood pressure cuffs as an example, I pretty rarely see reusable blood pressure cuffs in the inpatient environment. I see a lot of disposable blood pressure cuffs for that exact reason. And certainly one thing that we can do is to try to have as much similarity as possible for devices that we're using and reprocessing. This allows us to make sure that we're doing things consistently. We can look for outliers, and we can more closely monitor our teams to ensure that all of this information is going to be translated effectively. Earlier today, I was listening to the 2020 American Heart Association guidelines for basic life support and ACLS and other things. And it was very consistently brought up in the training that they talked about that if you don't, use CPR skills as an example, you really lose it about every 90 days as far as your overall competence. And that was not surprising to me at all. And I go back to, let's say I have a specialty instrument that's not used often. And let's say that we only use it a few times a year. Do I really have the competency to actually reprocess that device by only doing something a few times a year? And I would really venture to say, no, we don't. And that's a time where you want to get out those IFU books and actually have that information. That can be very, challenging with some of the work environments we have with reprocessing rooms and other things. The other thing we need to think about, too, is, again, who is going to actually be responsible for this? I remember working on an outbreak several years ago related to a GI type device that was an endoscope. And when I said, well, who reprocessed this device? And when was it reprocessed? And when was the procedure? Well, it turned out the procedure was actually done on Friday, and the device was not reprocessed until Monday. And the reason being is that the only people that were called in were the physician and the nurse. There was nobody from the reprocessing room that was actually called in with the expertise to clean the device. So it was simply left in the sink to cook up biofilms over the weekend. So from a manufacturer standpoint, there is a lot of responsibility to developing devices for their intended purpose, right, which is really sort of those indications for use, but also to think about how is a device going to be used, maintained, discarded, what happens if I need a loaner device, and sort of what are the differences that might take place between not only manufacturers, but also models. And this is one of the things that I think is so fascinating with the work that the Food and Drug Administration has done over the last 5 to 6 years as it relates to ERCP devices, because they found a lot of variability in human factors and human practice, as well as interpretation of how devices should be cleaned and sort of that accountability at the facility level. Well, if we know that there's device-related issues, then it would only make sense for us to do one of two things. Either we have to make the reprocessing process more simple and compatible and reliable, or we need to actually eliminate it altogether. And you'll see later in the presentation that that's exactly what FDA has essentially recommended, is that there's so much variability in not only the clinical factors associated with the device's use, like the bioburden present, how many times it's been repaired as an example, is a device that's currently in good maintenance sort of compatibility, and specifically, what's that rate of transmission to patients? Because we know that we can't, accurately define that by every single patient. Now, if I have a patient that is an oncology patient that is certainly at high risk because they're immunocompromised, that I know that person's at significant risk for developing an infection. What we don't know is always what that patient brings to the table. I don't necessarily know exactly what organisms, pathogens, previous infections that that patient is bringing to the party, right? And so that equation becomes very imbalanced. And so it's important to look at device design, but also look equally as to what can we do to reliably remove that bioburden that might be present there. Now, this is sort of a summary of the device, but then there's an added layer of complexity to this, which is some of the other things. I call it the sort of post-market or post-launch changes that might be made, right? And so we've got things like third-party servicing and accessories. You've got devices that in many cases are passed through these instruments that may or may not be validated, and those can all either negatively or positively impact the device's cleanability. And what we find through the data is that most often it's a negative impact. Even if you're using things like a borescope, it really doesn't tell us the entire picture because we have to know what we're looking at. We need to know what the action is from that. And a perfect example is I had somebody actually a few weeks ago send me a picture of a borescope image through a device, and they said, "What is this?" And I said, "Well, it looks like a biofilm, but it's really hard to tell that. Did you send it out to have it cultured?" And so there's a lot of questions that go into what is sort of my course of action if I discover something, and how do I render the device safe for patient use? So I want to give you a little bit of a tangible example that's completely unrelated to our traditional view of medical devices, and it's really about beds. And so for this example, I want you to sort of think about what does the bed feature, have as an advantage for the patient, specifically in the context of patient comfort and cooling, right? Now, if you think about cooling and patient comfort with these 4 different options, I would venture to say that most of you would pick the top 2 as your choice because they're ventilated, they've got the holes in there. So theoretically, air should go through there. It should be a lot cooler. Hopefully the mattress will be cooler, and therefore the patient will be cooler. That's a very accurate assumption. But what we didn't consider is the cleanability of the device and the user. So the user and sort of the person that's going to reprocess these devices, if you will, is actually environmental services in most cases. And what we didn't tell you is that the IFUs, when properly followed and a disinfectant is used, according to contact time, it actually takes 12 minutes to fully clean the top 2 beds, right? Because there's so many cracks and crevices there that it takes additional manual labor and work to actually render those devices. If we look at the bottom right, for example, where we have a completely flat surface, this is obviously a lot easier to clean because you can see everything. There's no cracks or crevices. It's one continuous surface. And so it's important to really consider, what are we going to use the device for? Where will it be used? And who's going to reprocess it? So that we always have something in place. Another example, and this is absolutely one of my favorites, is a device very similar to this, made by a very reputable manufacturer. This was years ago. I got a phone call and they said, we actually were just told by the manufacturer to disinfect this portable radiology equipment with alcohol prep pads. And I said, what? Alcohol prep pads? And I thought, this can't be. This has got to be a joke. And I said, send me the link for the document. And so I read the technical bulletin from the product manufacturer, and sure enough, it said use alcohol prep pads to disinfect the device. And so this is an example where, A, we have an incongruency with what clinical guidelines from organizations like CDC and ARN say, but we also have a big issue with just the logistical execution of what we're trying to do. And so for kicks and giggles, I called the manufacturer and I said, can I speak with someone in your technical support? Was transferred over and I asked them the following question. How many alcohol prep pads does it actually take to disinfect your device based on the surface area? And I was quickly told, someone will get back to you. And I thought, well, I really ticked them off now and they're not going to call me back. Well, they did call me back the next day and I give them great credit for that. And they said, we've never been asked this question. Why are you asking? And I said, well, because I'm trying to follow your manufacturer's instructions for use. And as such, I need to make sure that my staff are doing it correctly. And alcohol prep pads are approved by the FDA for use on patients' skin. They are not approved by the EPA for use on medical devices. And so this is an example where we have a clinical incongruency as well as a regulatory. Now, let's transition a little bit and think about the process. We've talked a lot about the personnel, but we need to ensure that we can safely use, reprocess, and maintain devices. Another example that comes so quickly to mind is I walked into an SPD type area and they were reprocessing devices for pulmonology, urology, and GI. And I said, what is that smell? And I walked in, it was a very potent smell, and it really smelled moldy. And I have a very sensitive nose to black mold. And I said, I think there's mold in here. And they said, no, there's no mold. This is a clean area. And I said, I'm just telling you, you should look around. I think there's mold in here. And so I went about my business, went to another part of the hospital for a meeting, came back, and somebody stopped me in the hall and they said, Dr. Garrett, how did you know there was mold in that room? And I said, well, why? Did you find mold? And they looked underneath the sinks and there was a leak. And there was a massive water leak that had caused a very overgrowth of black mold in that area. And so, again, it goes back to sometimes we're so close to an issue that we miss obvious clues and symptoms. And so it's important to think about that. One of the absolutely most important and I think exciting aspects of medical device hygiene as it relates to infection control is this sort of concept of human factors engineering. And you're going to hear so much more about this as new devices come to the market through the FDA clearance process, because the FDA is using this model on high-risk devices, things like endoscopes that are used in high-risk patients in high-risk areas and are very complex. And it's really all about a simple concept. Can humans, when trained consistently and in a standardized fashion, adequately and properly and consistently perform the work? So, for example, if I train 65 users using the same training process to actually reprocess device X, can they do that consistently and reliably, or is there going to be a human factors failure? And we've found so often that there are failures that take place. Part of that is just due to the individual, right? It may be your training, your background, the work pressures that you have on you. It could also be the design of the system and the workflow. You know, I sort of laugh when I go in rooms and I say, well, where's your clean area? And they say, right here to your right. And I said, well, where's your dirty area? We're right behind you on your left. And I look down on the floor and there's that, wonderful red line. And I'm thinking, well, the bugs certainly don't care if they jump back and forth. And so a lot of times we do things that don't necessarily make total sense, but we set that system up for failure as it relates to humans. And so much of human factors engineering is really driven back to not only systems, but also us as highly trained healthcare professionals that serve a role. So if you layer onto that some of the known reprocessing challenges at facilities, places like time stressors, where you've got physicians, for example, that are coming into the suite and saying, I need that device now, right? You have challenges as it relates to loaner devices, or even understanding if your staff are competent. If we go back to that CPR example that I was talking about earlier with the American Heart Association, if I lose that CPR skill every 90 days, that's only dependent upon how I was trained the first time. So a lot of times we see a lot of on-the-job training that may or may not be congruent with the manufacturer's instructions for use. And so it's great to have internal trainers and that sort of train the trainer module, excuse me, but it's only as good as it's proper and consistent and correct. And so we need to think about that very, very carefully. That training that's available needs to be role specific and competency driven. So for example, a nurse is not going to have the same competency as a tech. A physician may have a very different competency than both of those as well. And you may have other individuals that are involved in, for example, the transportation or the courier of those devices over to certain areas. So much of what we've talked about is really based on this old infection control concept of the spotting classification, right? And it really helps us determine where and when is the device going to be used and what's the appropriate level of reprocessing for that device. Of course, the goal here is to sort of build in a buffer of safety. So, for example, if I have a device that's very, very high risk and is going to be used invasively in sterile body cavities, then I really need to look at sterilization as the gold standard there. But can sterilization fail? Can we have sterilization failure or transportation failure of sterilized instruments? Of course, right? And it goes back to the differences between cleaning and disinfection. And we know that cleaning is going to give us much more of that initial soil removal, which is going to render that device more safe. And it's also going to help whatever germicidal or disinfectant agent or sterilization process you're going to use to be even more effective, right? And so many people are focused on sterilization or double HLD. And in reality, we need to make sure we've got the right sort of basic nuggets of the equation straightened out first. So let's take another example similar to what we did earlier with endoscope design. We know that there's going to be risk associated with these devices. They're very complex. Really, the device design has not changed a ton over the last 20 to 30 years. But this sort of equation that you see here on the slide talks about our overall margin of safety as it relates to current practices for reusable endoscope devices as an example. And what you'll find when we quickly do the math to see it sort of the low or the high end of cleaning versus the low or the high end of HLD is that there can be a very little or minuscule or even non-existent margin of safety when we're not properly doing things. And so this is extremely powerful for us to know that that margin of safety is really what's driving our clinical practice and the decisions that we make about the types of devices that we use. I go back to years ago, the Joint Commission put out a lot of guidance as it relates to the use of laryngoscopes in emergency circumstances. And we know that a laryngoscope has two basic parts, a blade and a handle. And so you saw a pretty quick transition of people to move to either disposable blades or reprocessable blades that could actually be sterilized. And again, we're trying to improve that overall margin of safety so that if we were to have a failure or we were to have some type of mishap in a step like cleaning or disinfection, what is sort of our error rate here? And part of that goes back to the removal of biofilms and other organic soil. When we get biofilms, we have challenges, right? We can't really remove those very easily. And in many cases, it requires that part or that area of the device to be completely discarded and thrown away. And we've seen this a lot with endoscopes. And so it's challenging to make sure we maintain these devices correctly as well. One final example is that we're not just seeing this in the perioperative space, but we're seeing challenges with other reusable devices that have high frequency of use in healthcare, like ultrasound probes. In this particular example, as it relates to the placement of things like PICC lines and other vascular access devices, where we have challenges. We know that we have practice-related issues, but also we have challenges with how devices can be reprocessed. If I'm going to use a device, for example, that's going to come in contact with, let's just say non-intact skin and mucous membrane, then by definition, that device should be high-level disinfected. If it's going to come in contact with sterile body cavities, then we know that we have to sterilize that device. And so there's a lot of challenges with sort of uniformly handling these types of devices that might be used. Well, that leads to I think, a very important groundbreaking study that the FDA commissioned back in 2015, which is called the 522 study. as it relates to understanding two basic things about flexible endoscopes. And this particular study was really the focus on ERCPs. They looked at two basic things. The first was, can a user reliably and consistently reprocess a device and render it safe if they follow the manufacturer's instructions for use, right? Sounds pretty reasonable. But the second sort of added level of complexity to this study was a human factors analysis to determine if people could actually do that and what was going to be the resulting microorganism here. So like I said, that first part is really human factors. The second part is, if they do it correctly, what organisms are going to be growing on these reprocessed devices. And for perspective, FDA was expecting a very low, if any, number of organisms that would be present on the devices. And let's just say that's not exactly what they found. And so as a result of these findings, there was a lot of emphasis about what do we do as a regulatory agency that doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, but is going to be very integrally involved in looking at outbreaks associated with these devices, how they're used in the marketplace, and sort of what those clinical hurdles are for device safety prior to release into the market. Because keep in mind, the FDA has one singular mission: to protect the health of Americans, right? And that may sound a little bit abstract for a regulatory body, but it's very similar to what CDC does, where they protect the public health, right? But FDA has a huge role in looking at medical devices critically, vaccines, obviously, is another big topic right now, to determine the safety and efficacy of these devices independently prior to them being released. And so FDA presented these findings to the CDC, and there was unanimous concern about this. And so as such, FDA's put out a series of safety alerts, specifically around ERCPs for infection, and really asked users to transition to either devices with disposable components or devices that eliminate the reprocessing need altogether, that are completely disposable. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's had scopes used in them, I just had a sinus scope not too long ago. I absolutely grilled my physician about what they were doing. I actually asked to see how they reprocess these devices. And I will tell you, I was a little bit shocked the first time I asked the question, because this is a really good practice, really good physician, really good team, and their reprocessing behaviors were not so great. Right. And so it really goes back to what can we do consistently and reliably to ensure the safety of the device and the patients that it's used on, but also protect us. I think one thing that we've learned through COVID-19 is that we are vulnerable populations as well as healthcare providers. Right. And so it is such an important conversation to have about not just the device's safety, but do we have the necessary and proper personal protective equipment accessible to us? So as such, FDA put out what I think are interesting but a little bit of convoluted reprocessing criteria that they're looking for, right? And you'll see sort of why this is an oxymoron here in a second. But the first one makes total sense. What's that intended use of the device, and is it labeled appropriately? So if it's going to be used in the oral mucosa or the GI tract or rectally, whatever it is, it needs to be properly labeled. The second is that you need to have good, validated reprocessing instructions to ensure that people can actually follow through with what you're trying to accomplish, right? And that makes such a huge difference here, right? And the third one is probably one of the most difficult to apply in every circumstance, which is based on that intended use and the manufacturer's IFUs and the patients that you're using it on. What's the appropriate reprocessing process? Is it I wipe it down with the disinfectant wipe? Is it I use a high-level disinfectant? Or is it something like a sterilization process? And we know we've got lots of innovation, especially in the sterilization process world, that's helping us drive some of these processes. Now, the last three, I think, personally, are kind of funny. Right. So the first one that's listed there is technically feasible. So whatever my instructions for use are, they need to be able to be, actually accomplished. Well, so I asked the question, if I have a device and let's say it takes 150 or 300 reprocessing steps, would we all agree that that's technically feasible? I would say no. And I think our human factors understanding of medical device reprocessing would also suggest no. But then they say it needs to be comprehensive. So again, that's sort of an oxymoron. So we'll put every step there, but we also want it to be understandable. So the average user is not going to be able to follow nor remember or even have access to, all 300 steps. And so the question becomes, what's that risk-benefit equation that says, do I reprocess devices or do I ideally try to use something that I can toss in the trash where I don't have this risk? And that really comes down to institutional conversations about things like clinical operations, finance, just-in-time delivery, the volumes that you might do. But if you think about it from an infection prevention standpoint, there's always going to be that risk with reusable devices. So there's essentially 4 different tiers that we can think about as we approach this very complex, convoluted, and highly regulatory-driven conversation, right? The first thing that many device manufacturers have done is they've tried to make existing devices better, right? They're trying to make them safer. Maybe they actually redesign their instructions for use for reprocessing. Maybe they completely change and overhaul their actual training programs, right? The second thing that we can do is identify things that are high risk, right? If I go back to a duodenoscope, for example, used for ERCPs, well, we know that the elevator is a major risk because it's got that piece that goes up and down. There's cracks and crevices. And so it would make sense to get rid of those pieces and make those components disposable if at all possible. What we're seeing a lot of development in, which I think is really exciting, is terminal sterilization as well as disposable solutions, right? And again, there's not something available for every single problem. But what we do know is that if we physically remove the risk and throw it away, or we eliminate the need for reprocessing, then we have a much better mousetrap as it relates to patient safety and reduced risk for infection control, right? I would love to be able to go into a patient's room as part of that informed consent process and say, the device that's being used on you has never and never will be used on anyone else. Personally, as a patient myself, I would pay for that to make sure that that risk is not present, especially knowing how many things could go wrong in this equation, right? So there's sort of an equally divided responsibility chain, if you will, or tree, as it relates to manufacturers, as well as clinicians in healthcare facilities. The manufacturers certainly need to design devices that are therapeutic and diagnostic and safe and efficacious, but they also have to provide validated reprocessing instructions to ensure that things are done correctly. And there's really nobody better to train users on medical devices than that device manufacturer's personnel themselves. Hopefully, they will be the absolute experts in this. And that's really where we shift over to what's our responsibility as a healthcare facility or a clinician or a clinical leader, right? We need to know where this device will be used, how it's going to be reprocessed, what equipment do we need, how am I going to train my staff, and what do I do about third-party things that might be used in the clinical practice environment that, frankly, I don't have much control over, that could cause any type and host of maintenance-related issues. And so this is very interesting for us. Right. Now, the next piece is really looking about staff training. And earlier I mentioned how important it is to have role-specific competency. And this is a big area that we have some general challenges with, right? We need to make sure that we have role-specific competency-driven objectives that are not just in the classroom or not just online learning, but are also going to be something that we validate with psychomotor assessment, right? We're putting our eyes on that person. We're actually looking at the scenario, and we're making sure that they do that correctly. I've seen a lot of facilities that have installed things like video cameras, and they're doing sort of that retroactive review. To me, as an infection prevention person, that's not very helpful because I don't have the ability to stop the process in real time, right? At this point, the device has already gone out the door and it's been used. And so it's very similar to the concept of surveillance cameras where it's very, often used for retrospective analysis of where did that burglar come from, did that person come from, but it's very rarely used for real-time intervention by law enforcement. Right. So we always want to train at 3 basic times. And my brother has drilled this into my head as an attorney that at the time of hire, annually, and when anything major changes. Right. So at the time I've hired, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it as part of my annual competency. And let's say we've changed devices in June in the middle of the year. I need to be retrained. There's also a very big value in my mind of having people that are certified in their field. I'm a big believer in having people that are board certified, whether in reprocessing, nursing, physicians. And I always go back to the concept that no one's going to have brain surgery from a neurosurgeon that's not board certified in neurosurgery, right? It just doesn't happen. You're going to go to the person that is the most skilled, well-educated, and is going to have specialty credentials in that particular area. And each one of us is really a mini infection preventionist, regardless of the role that you play. And so it's important to make sure that we do have certification in areas that is going to make the most sense for us, especially if you're doing the reprocessing role. This is so critical. And we've seen a lot of states even adopt regulatory or legal statutes recommending or requiring, in some cases, certified personnel. That being said, to our non-certified colleagues, this is not in any way a sort of statement of saying, well, non-certified people don't perform an equally great role, because in many cases they absolutely do. It really has very little to do with that and more about standing up for the profession and making sure that you are seen as the expert in this area, and you do have additional validation externally that says you met minimum criteria established based on the National Work Study. And I think that's so important for us to think about, right? Now, reprocessing has all kinds of issues that can go wrong, right? We've got things like the bedside clean. We've got multiple individuals that are involved in this process. We've got storage and all kinds of capabilities. I remember walking into a reprocessing room a few years ago, and I walked in and I'm thinking, why are there diapers everywhere? And I looked over, and every drying cabinet of these devices, there were diapers and chuck pads and all kinds of stuff at the bottom. And these things were soaked in water. And I said, what is going on here? And of course, they weren't properly drying out the instruments, and they were allowing them to essentially air dry. And all this water was falling out into the bottom of the cabinets. And so this goes back to, again, the drying and storage piece of this can be equally important. We also know that wet instruments can be, very, very bad from an infection transmission and microorganism growth standpoint. So how do we stop all this? As we get towards the end of today's program, you've heard a lot of great speakers talk about various different approaches, different ways to sort of skin the cat as it relates to competency. What can we do to make ourselves a more collaborative profession, which I think was a great theme throughout today's presentation and presenters. But a lot of this goes back to risk recognition and ensuring we have the right people and the right seats on the bus that are actually driving practice as well as standardization and usage of these devices. And so folks like our clinical value analysis, our biomedical engineering team, human factors experts, for example, if you're using devices that are going to be clean as part of the environment, then environmental services needs to be at the table. And my philosophy for many years in my career has always been to bring all of the stakeholders to the table that need to be there and to never, ever exclude anyone. And I think that that's so important when we think about collaboration and that sort of interprofessional shared mental model of reducing or eliminating healthcare-associated infections. It really does require that very comprehensive approach, right? And I think this is so important. So that prevention starts in the purchasing department, with making sure that they understand where and who's going to use that device, how often is it going to be used, bringing all the stakeholders to the table, and then ensuring that you have adequate resources either for reprocessing or you make an educated and conscious decision to use single-use devices that you can just eliminate, right? And there's conversation to be had about all of this, right? But when we go back to what the core expectation of the patient is, it's one simple thing. They want to leave in either an equal or better condition than when they came in, right? And I've sort of jokingly said in lectures before, I think, how many patients come in and sign an informed consent and check the box that says, yes, please give me an added healthcare-associated infection, right? Of course they don't. We don't want any patient to leave in a condition or have an adverse event like a death or some type of permanent disability related to a preventable healthcare-associated infection, right? Especially when it's directly tied back to things that we do as healthcare providers, right? And for our industry colleagues listening today, this is a big role for you to play as well. Industry delivers upon clinical innovation. It ensures that you have tools and resources available to solve some of these very complex medical issues with these patients, but we need to make sure we do it with an approach to safety with every single thing that we do. And I think this is really what defines people that are good from those that are great, right? You can be good at your job and you really don't rock the boat. You do what you're supposed to do consistently. But what makes people great and makes healthcare systems great is when they stand up for what's right, even in the most difficult times, and they make difficult decisions. One of the best examples I can think of was an infection preventionist that's a colleague of mine called me one day and she said, I feel like I need a drink. And I said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And she said, I literally got a phone call from the CEO today that said whatever I needed to do to reduce the risk to the patients based on some findings that I presented, I had his full authority to do. And I said, well, what did you do? And she said, I shut down 12 operating rooms today for the entire day, and they will be shut down again tomorrow. And I said, oh. And she told me what her findings were. And I said, well, that was very wise that you did that to ensure that there was no further harm. And I said, well, what's been the reaction of the CEO to, that lost revenue and reschedules and all this stuff? And she said, he called me twice today and said how appreciative he was that I stood up for what was right and that he stood behind me with any fallout that there was, right? And that's leadership on both the infection preventionist as well as the C-suite executive. And so patients expect to have good quality care that's safe and reliable, period. And we need to be transparent. We need to work as an interprofessional team, and we need to build systems of high reliability. So how do we do that? Part of that is that human factors piece that we talked about. Another piece is really on device informatics, right? And I think about, getting in a really complex, sophisticated elevator, and there's a display in there, and it says, we predict that this elevator will fail in 43 days. Would you like to schedule service? Right now, as somebody riding in the elevator, I don't want to see that. But as a maintenance person that might be responsible for maintaining that elevator, having a 43-day lead time based on predictive analytics that a device may fail, which in this case, in the medical device world, could result in adverse event or infection, right? Gives me an idea of how I can be preventative with my servicing, right? Because we know devices that are not properly serviced and not properly maintained are at increased risk in most cases for transmission of infection. And lastly is, how do we build cultures that are designed to support doing that right thing by reducing infection risk, by improving patient safety, by frankly removing costs out of the system as well. And I'm a huge fan of two programs that I would encourage you to check out if you've not heard of them already. The first is Team Steps, which is available through the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And it's all about healthcare communication across disciplines. What to do when you need to escalate a situation. What to do if you have an adverse event. What if somebody starts screaming at you in the perioperative space and you don't know what to do, right? And so this is a free program that's available online. And there's a second one, which I'm a big fan of, which is actually done by Outcome Ingenuity as a company, that's called the Just Culture Principles. And you may have heard of that. And it simply put is really look to the design of the system. And if the design of the system failed, the individuals where the harm was caused. Right. And so there's people that will, unfortunately try to cause harm, which is very, very few minority. And then there's many instances, probably 99% of them, where our system was designed not to be successful. And so Just Culture is all about a non-punitive approach to ensuring that we can properly do this. Right. So how do we get towards that sort of end game? Well, we know that there are basic things that we can do and start in a journey as it relates to medical device hygiene and infection control. We can look at, is the device's reprocessing instructions for use even reasonable? Is it something we can accomplish? Do we need to sterilize the device? And if we do sterilize the device, what's our impact to clinical workflow? How long does it take? I worked with the hospital several months ago, and they were sterilizing all of their duodenoscopes as an example. And I said, well, what sterilization mode do you use? Well, they said ETO. And I said, okay, well, how long does it take for you to get the devices back? And they said, well, we don't get them back for a few days, right? Because they had to send them out, and there was a whole process. So that probably doesn't make sense from a continuity of clinical operations. We also know that there needs to be better in-service materials that are going to be truly interactive and specific to our role. I would love to see more manufacturers actually have in-service materials where when you sign on, it says, who are you? Are you a nurse? Are you a tech? Are you a physician? Are you an infection preventionist, for example? And it customizes that content so that you have good personalized delivery of this information. There's also a lot of great tools out there related to real-time monitoring that give us insights. but they're not the end-all be-all, and it's important to make sure that we think about them in a broader context of what does this data really tell us, and how do we interpret that? And that really leads to sort of the end game, which I think is that disposable single-use device where we can just toss it in the trash and move on with it. But again, that's not always possible for every single person. So FDA hosted a series of meetings, and out of that came this list, which I think is really great, about device design features that can help us look at new innovation, that are going to help us look at safer device usage as well as patient safety risk. So having disposable components, getting to a disposable completely, making sure you can see all the parts and pieces. You know, if I think about a traditional endoscope, why not make it clear, right? You know, I'm sure there are reasons for that from a design standpoint, but if I can see the risk, I have the ability to get to the risk, which means I can mitigate it and hopefully remove it. Right? So I have provided you a couple tools and resources. Hopefully that will be helpful to you. The first is the CDC CMS checklist for medical device surveys. I think this is a great tool to have if you've not checked it out. It's available free of charge on their website. And it is a great thing when you have your Joint Commission, DNV, HHHC surveys to pull this out and have done this in the last quarter. I really recommend that you as an institution do this on a quarterly basis and share those findings. Be transparent. Say to the survey, this is what we found, and here's our action plan on how we're correcting it. I've seen this done many instances, and it's a great thing. The next one is something that the CDC was kind enough to provide, and it's really sort of this medical device traffic alert, if you will, for purchasing, right? So elements to avoid, meaning don't do these things. Elements of concern is, of course, that yellow light or caution, and then there's going to be these areas where the extra scrutiny is needed based on the known or anticipated comorbidities, things like being immunocompromised, like, you know, sterile processing, the NICU, oncology, where you're going to have high risk of potential failures. I've also included a pre-purchase checklist that you're welcome to use. Hopefully this will be helpful as you think about some basic questions related to medical device purchasing. And really think about this as a to-do list, right? Look at all of the equipment that you have. Sit down with biomedical engineering, purchasing, make sure you have good confidence in your reprocessing instructions. Make sure that's evaluated up front in your process before this ever gets into your system. And then we want to look at how do we sort of build that legal, ethical, and professional responsibility as it relates to a legally defensible competency model. Again, that should be role-specific, driven based on the competencies of that position, and also have a backup plan. Right? And so that way we can evaluate all of this information critically and determine what we might need to do to risk mitigate, but also have a plan in place for that unfortunate day where we have to notify patients because there was some type of breach or failure. You don't want to be developing your outbreak sort of conversation the day you have an outbreak. You want to make sure that stuff's all done up front, vetted by your legal team. PR needs to be involved, and certainly risk management to really help us do that. So here's a couple additional references that hopefully will be helpful to you. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Lindsay to see if we've got any questions that have come in from our attendees today.
All right. Wonderful, Dr. Garrett. Thank you so much for that presentation and for helping us really put the cherry on top of an incredible day talking about infection prevention and resisting surgical site infections and superbugs. We did have some questions come in. So before we get into these, I just want to make a quick note to the audience tuned in. Along the bottom of your screen, you will see a little gold icon. That icon will take you to the conference survey and your CE certificate. You will also be emailed a link in about an hour. The first question that came through says, what level of breach should warrant communication with the state health department and notification of patients?
You know, that is probably an excellent question, probably one of the best I've been asked. You know, I think part of this is going to be dependent upon what your state regulation is. In some states, there is regulatory guidance that requires you to notify for all, for some. A lot of places like your accreditation bodies will say for purposes of a sentinel event where there's going to be a known or anticipated permanent harm or death to a patient. So I think that's one thing. Now, there's also a professional and in some cases a legal responsibility to notify organizations like the FDA based on adverse events. And keep in mind that we can't ever fix things if we don't know about them. And so it's not meant to be, let's go run and tell somebody. It's really meant to be looking for safety signals, sort of like the smoke that's being raised above the campfire to say we have a problem. And that's really important. So when I think about breaches that would require the state health department, it's things where there's going to be a likelihood of transmission of an infectious disease like hepatitis. If we've got HIV, some type of superbug like CRE, those are all no-brainers. Those should be notified to the health department. When you have an identified breach and reprocessing, even if you don't see any harm, better to have a conversation with the health department. And certainly if there's some type of visible adverse event, let's say that a colon got perfed, or you had an instrument that fell out inside of a patient and the patient's now in the ICU, or, on a horrible day, you have a patient that dies from an injury. Those are all no-brainers as well. But I am a major proponent of reach out to the state health department, have a conversation with them, and you together decide what that next course of action is, because I will tell you from experience, you do not want to get to know your health department after an outbreak has been released to the news, or one of your employees goes and tells someone, or an attorney finds out about it. And keep in mind that every time that adverse events are posted to the FDA's website, there are attorneys that go out there and scour that information. And so that is just, unfortunately, the rules of the game that you have to be aware of. But transparency will always win over hearts. It's something to think about.
Okay. The next question that came in, disposables make sense in reducing infections. How do we weigh the safety versus environmental implications?
That's an awesome question. I will say I try to always be green when at all possible. But we all know that there's always a trade-off. And I go back to, if you come to me as an infectious disease person, you say, okay, Hudson, we've got two choices. We can do this or we can do that. And the first choice is we can do something that completely eliminates risk, right? So all of the things that we've talked about in my presentation today simply go away because there is no more reprocessing. But there's going to be potential landfill implications. That is something that we should all weigh carefully, but I think it's a bigger conversation. So let's say that I have a disposable device, whatever that may be. If I reprocess that device, I know that I'm going to have PPE. I'm going to have gloves, gowns, mask, whatever. I'm going to have chemicals. I'm going to have reagents. I'm going to have all the stuff that's used to reprocess that device. And then I need to multiply that times the number of times that I would do that in a year, right? And I think that we'll find that in most instances, the landfill burden is not near what we think it is. And a lot of the devices, at least that I've seen that are coming out, actually do have recyclable capabilities. So I'm never, ever personally, and this is just me speaking personally, I'm never going to pick a device that is going to make it less green. I'm not going to pick that as sort of the risk equation over something that's going to eliminate risk. So I'm always going to side with safety of a patient and my provider team over something that's green, if that makes sense. But it is definitely a question, but I think we can very easily rationalize that if we look at the logistics and all the things that go into the equation. Okay.
Wonderful. Just to let the audience know, we are going to go over time. If you're willing and able to stick around to listen to some of these question and answers, we encourage you to do so. The next question, what should we do differently as it relates to medical device hygiene in this era of COVID-19?
So that's a very timely question. COVID-19 has taught us so much. It's taught us a lot about resilience. It's taught us a lot about our sort of gaps in PPE and our vulnerabilities. But the good news is that, the bacteria, or I'm sorry, the virus in this case itself is pretty easy to get rid of. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is not very hardy on the environment. So it's a very different conversation than when we look at bacteria like CRE and some of the other MDROs that might exist out there. So our normal processes for HLD, sterilization, certainly, even low and intermediate level disinfectants that are used on environmental surfaces are for the most part very, very efficacious. And so I think it's less a conversation about changing what we're doing as much as it's a conversation about looking at the awareness of our sort of general safety as a team, making sure we have the right PPE. One of the most horrifying calls I got since February was a woman who was distraught. She'd been on a webinar with me actually 2 years ago, and she had kept my contact information, and she said, She said, Hudson, I'm terrified to go to work. And I said, what's going on? And she said, she actually forwarded me the email from their administration that said, we don't have enough PPE, but we don't care. You need to go provide clinical care. We just have to do what we have to do. And so they were literally being sent into rooms with COVID patients, doing bronchs without proper N95 protection, right? Knowing that the CDC's guidelines for aerosol generated procedures were out, and it was a horrible position. And so I think what we have to do differently is really focus on us as a team, make sure we're very aware, and that we have, frankly, a sustainable solution to still work clinically. I am by no means a fan of just using disposable N95s everywhere, as an example. I actually use a reusable elastomeric respirator when I'm at the hospital. And I did that by design to make sure that I had some type of guaranteed respiratory protection, right? That's not a solution that fits for everybody in every department. If you're not going to be exposed to COVID patients, it makes total sense to use a disposable N95 for just, intermittent use. But we need to think about what we might do in our specialty to make sure that we have reliable protection, that every single person has that control, because the fear factor is definitely out there.
Okay. Can you speak to what the purpose of the FDA's 522 study for ERCP scopes is, and what are the key findings and impacts?
Sure. So I was actually on the committee, and it was a very eye-opening / stressful experience. But essentially, as I think I mentioned earlier, the 522 had two basic objectives. The first was to determine how human factors played into reprocessing, and could devices be reliably reprocessed according to the manufacturer's IFUs. And again, it was all focused for this study on ERCPs because of the risk associated with duodenoscopes. And the second one was really looking at what is growing on reprocessed devices. And I'll give you an example that should alarm all of us is, let's say that you get back culture results and you have to call an expert at the CDC to even figure out what the organism is, because no one's heard of it, right? And it turns out that organism was actually pigeon poop that had come in from an outside HVAC system gap in the wall for the reprocessing room, right? And so these are all findings that FDA was sort of thinking, how in the world did this happen? So it's not just about the device, and it's not just about the people. It's also equally important about the environment in which we're practicing and handling these devices. And so that's really a big, big thing. And so, FDA's sort of expectation was that these high concern, highly pathogenic disease-causing organisms would be present hardly none of the time. And that was not exactly what they found in reprocessed devices. And so that's really where those safety alerts that I referenced came out. So I think our implication is to think long and hard about, can we fix reprocessing of a reusable device, or does it just make more sense to go to a disposable capability? And I think you're going to see a lot more to the latter with the disposable capabilities, where you do have the ability to physically engineering sort of throw away that risk and get rid of it.
Okay. This is a question nicely tied. Is reprocessing of medical devices even possible to render them safe?
That's a tough question to answer genuinely. I think that, we're all designed with the best of intent. But what we found is that things don't always happen as they should. Are following the manufacturer's IFUs, there could still potentially be risk. And that's what we found with the 522 study. We also know that humans are highly variable, and the folks that are reprocessing these devices are under immense stress. And so I think that equation is very negatively balanced on the side of risk. And so for myself, I think I'm always a proponent of take that human risk out of the equation and use that human capital in the most appropriate place. Maybe it's in the actual suite where we're actually helping clinically, or certainly repurposed for other procedures where there are not disposable solutions. So I think reprocessing failures have told us that there are more, a lot more work to be done.
Okay. Is this issue with reprocessing failures fixable in your mind, and what should we do in terms of human error?
I think we just covered that one. So I think that was the...
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
How can I make my infection preventionists engage with us in sterile processing more? Some of them seem scared of our department.
I hear this all too often. Part of that is the infection preventionists are a very overly stressed, probably under-resourced department in many institutions because they have just a tremendous amount of responsibility and area to cover. But some of the best practices that I've seen are where they're actually embedded in departments and really have a departmental responsibility to come in on a frequent basis, observe, really be a part of staff meetings, education, because you don't ever want to get to know your health department or your infection preventionist when something bad happens, right? And so our IP colleagues can be amazing resources to us. And so make them feel like part of the family, invite them down to be part of meetings. And frankly, I would encourage them to come, disinfect devices, make sure they can reprocess devices, let them experience what it's like to live in PPE in a high humidity environment in some of these places. And so I think that that's so important for us to build that bigger family by making them feel a part of it versus sort of an outsider where they're coming down when there's a problem or any type of, training issue or some type of emergency.
Speaking of training, how often should reprocessing staff be trained ideally?
So if we go back to sort of the core legal requirements and things that people will look for from a legal standpoint, it's really at that time of hire annually and then anytime something changes, right? However, we know with other things like CPR, which is a very, very basic skill, that we start to lose that competency over 90 days time period. And so I think it's a great idea to do some type of educational training event that's both psychomotor, so hands-on, but also in the classroom at least once a month. It's a great way to get out CEs. It's a great way to keep your staff engaged. It's a great way to recruit people to your department because you're always continuously providing them education. And I think that's really a better model than to rely on something being done annually. And remember, if we're doing the training internally, have to also be expert enough to do that. So for example, in North Carolina, I know nurses cannot receive competency checkoffs by anyone other than a nurse. And so I was working with the health system there, and they only had one RN that was trained and competent in this particular skill. And so that individual had to train the entire health system. So they had to train hundreds of nurses because of what the state law said. So I think it's important to think about how that training will be executed logistically as well and build more champions to be part of the party.
Okay. This question came in: as a school nurse, how or what should we use to keep sanitization, especially during this time of COVID or flu season?
That's a great question. Our big risk in the next few months is a concurrent circulating, influenza viruses as well as the SARS-CoV-2 virus and causing COVID infection. I personally actually have treated several patients that have had both, and it's not pretty, regardless of their current health circumstance. And so I think to this point is I am a huge proponent of allowing people to get back in schools under safe conditions. And so I'm so glad to see that there's a school nurse on this program. That being said, there are basic principles that CDC has outlined, like ensuring that when someone comes in and when they leave and between class periods to require hand washing or hand sanitizer, to make sure that if we're changing, the opportunity for people to go from one period to another or change classrooms or activities, let's go ahead and wipe down that desk. Let's wipe down that surface area. Certainly we can do social distancing and that's great, but it's not always logistically possible every single time. So I think that that's a huge thing to think about. So frequent disinfection, frequent hand hygiene, obviously universal source control with masking is helpful. And another thing that we need to think about, particularly in school environment, is as much fresh air as possible. So we've seen a lot of building engineers up the air intake cycle so that there's more air circulatory cycles, similar to what we do in the perioperative space, right, where we can have more fresh air coming in. And there may be environments where that's not possible, and there's portable HEPA filtration units that can be deployed that can also aid in that as well. But hopefully that answers the question, and I think it's, again, great to see that we've got a school nurse asking these wonderful questions.
Absolutely. This one says AHA and Laerdal now offers RQI, which is a quarterly BLS validation. We use it in our hospital, and it's working great in improving BLS skills. I think just a comment more than a question, but anything you'd like to add to that?
It's very ironic that they sent that in because I just got off the phone with the American Heart Association about 2 hours ago talking about this very issue. And it was so funny because I was thinking about the implications to today's talk. So I think there's a lot of value in that. So if you're not familiar with that model, it's really looking at ongoing quality assurance to ensure continued competency. And so it's not just with HA. There's many other organizations like HealthStream is doing a lot of this type of stuff. And I think it will really be the wave of the future. So again, we have two choices. Do we sort of focus in on reprocessing with the potential for human error and all the things that go with that, or do we move to a reprocessable, throwaway model that's going to be disposable? And those are questions that we have to ask ourselves. Where are we going to spend sort of our attention units and our areas of focus?
Okay. What is the most important thing to do with medical devices to reduce the risks of HAIs?
I think it's a very tough question. I would say go in it with your eyes open. There is no risk that's too small to address. And I would really engage outside people to make sure that you have the right eyes looking at the risk. Probably the best example I can give related to this is when I go into hospitals and I say, what's your hand hygiene compliance? And almost 99% of the time, they'll say between 90 and 100%. I said, really? I said, that is just outstanding. I'm sure that you must be so proud. And then I'll turn around and say, can I have 20 minutes of free access to walk through your facility and you wait here? And I'll take myself and I'll take my happy little butt down the hallway. They don't know who I am. I don't have a badge on. They have no clue who I am. And I will walk the hospital floors and I will come back. And 100% of the time, I have not found hand hygiene to be anywhere close to 50% in these institutions. And so it's all about that trained eye and observer, because so often we're so close to the problem that we really miss the things that are right underneath our nose because we want to see the very best. And I think that's an opportunity here, is to make sure that we have that interprofessional approach, that we have ongoing safe cultures and environments where we can speak up if there's risk or harm, and that we're making good evidence-based decisions to improve patient safety and, frankly, keep us safe. Because I think COVID has taught us that it's not just about patient safety. It's also about the staff safety to ensure that we can reliably perform procedures safely. And was that the last question, Lindsay?
Oh, apologies. I was on mute. Nothing like ending the day on mute. All right, everyone. The universe's way of saying enjoy your Friday, everybody. Dr. Garrett, that was the last. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation, for tying it all together with how we can collaborate for interventional infection prevention as one of the most critical aspects for providing safe surgical outcomes. If anyone has additional questions that come to mind, feel free to reach out to Dr. Garrett directly. He's more than happy to engage in conversation with you. A special thank you to 3M for their part in making today's event possible. As we close, we want to recognize all of the professionals who contribute to safe reprocessing of surgical instruments across the globe, and every day that you advocate for patient safety through the year, for all that you do, and for choosing to spend your day with us, for educating yourself. We'd like to thank you for your dedication to professional development and to best practice. At this session's close, you will be directed to the Beyond Clean virtual conference and webinar credit hub. You'll have access to all 7 sessions for today on demand, as well as the CE survey. You can also, like I mentioned before, click on the little gold icon at the bottom of your screen. We are thankful for you. We hope to see you again at the next Beyond Clean virtual event. We certainly have an action-packed rest of the year for you. So connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and by all means, we encourage you to keep fighting dirty. Have a great day, everybody.